Hello from the Heartland. My name is Jenna, and this is SmartHER News. News when it matters and why it matters. Our SmartHER series features unique people who help us think and live smarter. Well, we're back with author, journalist, correspondent David Satter, and it has been exactly 1 week since the last interview that we had. And we had such a response to that interview, David. I just wanted to have you back to continue our conversation about what we're watching in Ukraine, but also the perspective that you add from decades of reporting in the Soviet Union, through the Cold War, through the collapse of the Soviet Union, and then the rise of modern day Russia. We tried to get exactly to the hour that we spoke last time. This is how precise we're trying to be, because the world is changing so fast. And look at all that's happened in the last week. And maybe that's where we need to begin. I mean, what do you think about what we've seen in the last week, David?
Well, it's appalling, of course. I mean, it's appalling not just for the Ukrainians who've suffered and are going to suffer as they now bomb cities, but for the poor Russian soldiers who've been thrown into this. Many of them had no idea where they were being sent. They were told that they were being sent for maneuvers on the border with Ukraine. They didn't realize they were being thrown into a war. And in fact, many of them have been sent into this inferno in violation of Russia's own regulations, because according to the regulations, you can't just send draftees into a war zone unless they sign contracts. Well, they're being forced to sign those contracts. They're being intimidated. They're being beaten. And they're being thrown in large numbers into a fight for which they're not prepared. There are two call-ups in Russia for the draft in June and in December. A lot of young men, and these are 18, 19-year-old boys, who are being thrown into a war against a very hardened enemy, which has been fighting for 8 years in the Donbass. And they have less than 2 months of training, if that. They're not prepared for war, and they're being mowed down. And they weren't given any choice as to whether they wanted to fight. Many of them didn't even know where they were being sent. So it's a tragedy in every respect. And it's, of course, ongoing, and it's likely to get worse.
Well, and that's what's difficult, even about doing an interview at any given moment, David. It feels like the entire world could change yet again, and that somehow the world that we knew last week has even changed. How do you think the world has changed in the last week?
Well, I think that for Americans, it's changed in a way that may even be in some respects positive, because we've been reminded of the evil in the world. I think for a couple of decades, we forgot that there's evil in the world. Even September 11th didn't wake us up. And we really degenerated. I think that's what all this wokeism is. That's what all the emphasis on gender, race, on the things that potentially can divide population are a sign of. But it's also a much more dangerous world at the same time, because now, for the first time, we do face a situation in which the United States could go to war. Now, I think that that's not extremely likely at the moment, because the government and the Biden administration, and I think that any administration would do the same, is trying to avoid direct conflict with Russia. But we're definitely going to be in a situation in which, for our own security, we're going to have to aid the Ukrainians. We are aiding them, and if indeed they are defeated in the initial phase of the war, will be aiding an insurgency, and this will be an insurgency like few others, which will simply tempt the Russians to threaten and possibly attack. So we're not out of the woods by any means. The years of complacency, which you could even describe as the years of mediocrity, are coming to an end. We're now facing a situation in which, as a nation, we either are going to accept our responsibilities or face the fact that people as degraded and as amoral as Vladimir Putin are able to dictate terms. And I think that even the most complacent American is not going to want that kind of situation.
But what does confronting it look like? What does it look like to stand up to Vladimir Putin in this situation in the right way? Everyone's asking for what is the right solution here? Well, what is our right next step as America, David? How would you answer
Well,
that
the
question?
standing up to the example for standing up to Putin and to the Russian regime is being demonstrated by the Ukrainians and by President Zelensky. Our role is to help them at this point. And that means not being afraid. That means, of course, giving the Ukrainians everything they need, including intelligence support, which will be very important. All of the Western intelligence agencies should be focused on Ukraine to communicate to the Ukrainian military every move that's being made by the Russian forces. I think that's happening. But at the same time, we have to be ready for hardship in our own country. That means a total oil and gas embargo. That means sky high inflation in this country. But if we can't have it both ways. We can't say that we're not going to risk American lives and we're not going to risk American prosperity. American prosperity is going to suffer. It has to if we are serious about cutting off all sources of income to Russia, which is the fastest way to bring them under control. And of course, there'll be internal protests. There'll be some people in the U.S. who won't see the point. And we're at that time has arrived.
I have so many questions from that point, including how strong you think the Vladimir Putin regime is at this time. But to set the
Mhm.
stage, I want to remind everybody that you actually have lived in Russia, that you know the language, you read, you write, you speak Russian. These are things that I don't do, David. There are things that a lot of people don't do that are talking all over the American press right now. So I want to take advantage of that for a moment, and then we can go on to some of these bigger, kind of broader questions that are really significant at this time. But from your work and because of your language expertise, what have you seen in Russian media? What are you hearing from your sources that we should know about what's happening in Russia, or that's notable about how this story is being told there?
Well, the story is, I mean, what's happening is that the Russian regime is cracking down on any source of independent information. For one thing, they're banning the use of the word war. This is not a war, it's a special operation. They're not the Yandex search engine, which has about 30 million users in Russia, which is their big search engine, does not use the word war. It uses the word special operation, and it's censored in other ways. This is one way of keeping the vast majority of the Russian population in the dark.
Wait a minute. So
The
is that like the Russian Google? So if I was in Russia and I
Yeah,
wanted
yeah,
to
it's
look up war,
roughly equivalent. Yeah, roughly equivalent. I, for example, use the Russian internet a lot, and I use Yandex. There's a lot of Russian language material on Yandex, and it's a leading search engine for Russia or Russian speakers.
interesting.
Um, Echo Moskvy, the radio station, TV Rain, the television station that were uh, somewhat independent before all this started. They've been blocked. Their sites have been blocked. The uh, press, which is censored, the censored press, the non-independent press, has been given instructions to only use information from official sources. Demonstrations are banned for the time being. So what's happening is the Russian regime is trying to close off the population from information. Even the Ukrainians have created a site for parents of Russian soldiers to give them information about the fates of their sons. That site's been blocked by the Russian censorship. The Russian military authorities are giving very little information. The soldiers' mothers group in Russia is having a very hard time getting any kind of information from the Russian military authorities. They've been besieged by calls from worried parents who don't know where their sons are, don't know what's happening. Were not told that they were being transferred to the Ukrainian border and to Ukraine itself, have had their telephones confiscated. But the long and short of all this is that a completely isolated population, which is subjected to nothing but propaganda, is not going to have the moral wherewithal to prevail in a long war. For that, you have to believe in your victory. You have to believe in what you're doing. They're not going to believe in it. And it's every reason not to believe in it, because they see that the authorities themselves don't believe in it and are trying. The thing that Americans need to bear in mind is that the Putin regime is just as much an enemy of the Russian people as it is of the Ukrainian people. The Russian people are being manipulated and used by a very, very small group of people who have stolen their wealth and monopolized power, and are holding on to that power with the help of manipulation, terror, corruption. And
Do you see?
and I believe it can. I believe that there's a good chance, at least, that we're going to begin to see serious challenge from within Russia.
That was my question. I was curious. What are the cracks? Do you see cracks in the foundation, and where are those cracks coming from?
So at the moment, they're pretty small, but there are signs. Russian units surrendering to the Ukrainians, sabotaging their equipment. Before the invasion began, two Russian generals, Leonid Ivashko and Yevgeny Sevastyanov, protested against plans for an invasion, and they explained absolutely accurately the reason. They said that this is the response of the regime to its own inability to solve the country's problems, and to try to rally people around itself with a kind of false patriotism, false nationalism. Well, if two generals, I mean, I think they were both retired generals, were willing to say that, you can bet that there are a lot of people who think it. And in fact, there's a history, strange as it may seem, Russian soldiers are not automatons. There's a strong tradition of unconditional obedience in the Russian military, but it's not absolute. There have been cases in which they've defied their commanders. The most famous of those cases was in August 1991, when the Alpha Group, which was an elite special forces unit, defied orders to attack the White House, which was the head of the Russian government, was surrounded by civilians who were protesting the seizure of power by a pro-communist coup. That was still in the days of the Soviet Union. And the members of the Alpha Group were perfectly aware, and they said this later in it and at the time, that they could take the White House. That was the building which was the headquarters of the Russian government, which was under Boris Yeltsin, as opposed to the overall Soviet government, which was under Gorbachev, who had been removed in the coup and which was controlled by the coup leaders. In any case, they said, we can take the headquarters of the Russian government in 15 to 30 minutes, no problem. But there'll be thousands of dead. It'll be worse than the Tiananmen massacre in China. Tiananmen Square. And they refused the orders. And in the Chechen War, you had cases of commanders refusing to send their soldiers into an inferno. And at one point, after 18 months of war, when the Russian public was absolutely sick of the war in Chechnya and disenchanted with the military and political leadership, General Alexander Lebed said 30% of the soldiers in Chechnya are ready to turn their guns on the people who sent them here, and 10% are thinking about it. So, we could have a situation like that in Ukraine.
What happened to those two generals that spoke out about an invasion?
Still, they're still there. They're still there. I mean, it's not. Putin is trying to carry out something in a semi-free society, or a society that's not totally controlled, that could only be successfully executed by a totalitarian power. It's the reason it's not totalitarian in part is because of the greed of the people who are in charge. They love money too much, and they love their ties to the West as long as they can, gorge themselves. But they made the mistake of thinking that under those conditions they can still do what the Soviet Union did, and that's not the case.
This is obviously the rise of the cell phone is something that has changed my life as a journalist. In my graduate work in New York City, this is going to make me sound prehistoric, David, way back in the days when I was young, when I was just doing my graduate work.
Jenna, you're still young.
But way back when, 20 years ago, almost 20 years ago, I was doing some graduate work in New York. You had to go out to the outer boroughs. So you would go to Queens and Brooklyn and Bronx, and you'd find all your stories there. And you had a deadline, and you didn't have you weren't texting sources. You weren't sharing video over your phone. I mean, you had a cell phone, but you have seen the rise of the cell phone as well in Russia. And this is, even though you're seeing media sources being clamped down on, I'm just curious what you think of this, that in the palm of our hand, we're communicating, and you have families that have a Ukrainian side of the family and a Russian side of the family, and they have to be communicating in some way. And I'm just curious what you've heard about that, or what you think that this little piece of technology, no matter how often we want to throw it out the window, has impacted what we're seeing here in this particular war.
Sure. I mean, they've taken away the phones from the Russian soldiers.
And I just talked to a lawmaker in Ukraine, David. I didn't mention that before we started our interview. And she said the same thing. And I said, how is that possible? I thought there's been text messages that have been shared between soldiers. We saw the Ukrainian representative to the UN share a text message between a soldier and his mother. It's hard to verify any of these things.
Before he was killed, before that
yes,
young
before
man
he was killed. And for those, we'll put a link underneath this video so you can see it, because it was actually, if you've seen this viral video, you may not realize that it was actually shared at the United Nations as well. And it's difficult to verify.
No, I saw that. I saw
right.
that, of course.
Well, but she said that some of the Russians got lost. The soldiers got lost because the Ukrainians took down the signs, the street signs. And then the
Chechens did the same thing.
And then they didn't have their phone. So they couldn't figure out where they were going. I mean, you just can't even imagine that's the situation for a soldier on the ground.
They probably didn't have decent maps either, because this is a repeat of what happened during the first Chechen War in a lot of ways. We saw the same thing. And in fact, the Russians have been in the habit of throwing completely unprepared troops into a meat grinder. Is a Russian tradition. I mean, the accounts of the Russo-Japanese War in 1905 describe the same thing. And the Russians have also a tradition of underestimating their enemy, which leads them, in the case, I'm not sure if we mentioned this in our last discussion, but In the case of the first Chechen war, the Russian Minister of Defense, Pavel Grachev, said that he could uh, capture Grozny, the capital of Chechnya, in 2 hours with one parachute regiment. Well, we know that didn't happen. So
So do you think do you think the phone is changing anything, that despite all the clampdown of the press, of individuals' ability to tell their own story through their phones, do you think that is that a weakness? Is that
well,
something
of
to know
course, I
about
mean,
inside Russia?
the Ukrainian side will document everything. How much of it is going to get through to the Russians? Certainly they're trying to clamp down and limit that to the degree they can. It's a changing situation. I understand that Russia's been taken off some of the social media, but there's still telephone lines. And no, the word is going to get it. They can only slow the flow of information. They can't clamp down on it altogether. It's not the Soviet Union anymore, and the technology has moved beyond that. But what's really going to have an impact, at least in the short run, is the economic collapse plus the terrible death toll. They're going to try to conceal the death toll. They've done that in every war. In the case of the Afghan war, they instructed mothers not to tell anyone where their son died. In the case of the Chechen wars, they hid the number of casualties. They're not going to be able to do that. I mean, if the Ukrainian numbers are even approximately correct, it's a testimony to two things. First, that the Russians didn't want to fight. And second of all, that they were absolutely unprepared for battle. They're talking about 5,000 dead in 1 week. There were 5,000 dead in the Chechen war in 18 months. So I think that the pressure is going to mount. Now, the regime may well resort to terror, which will be terrible, but it won't work either.
Do you think Vladimir Putin this week is stronger or more vulnerable than last week?
No, he's more vulnerable. He's more vulnerable. All of the people around him, every person he comes in contact with, understands that if he can take him out, he will inherit everything. He will, the whole country and the whole world. Now, Putin has gone to great lengths to make sure that no one who has those type of thoughts will get anywhere near him. But you never know. It's a peculiarity of authoritarian regimes, and it's a peculiarity of Russia that, the person who is the most fawning, the most obsequious, the most loyal, may have other thoughts, and may really be waiting his moment. So Putin is going to have to be uncomfortable about that possibility.
How do you think that's affecting his decision making?
Well, we see, I mean, his decision making, I for one, I must admit, did not think he would go this far. I thought he would go to the very brink, but not actually launch a suicidal invasion. Well, I was incorrect. And it reminds me of another mistake I made back in the days of perestroika and the Soviet Union, when I thought that Gorbachev would not go as far as he did in allowing glasnost, because it would lead to the end of the Soviet Union. Well, I was right that it led to the end of the Soviet Union, but wrong about Gorbachev. I mean, he did go so far that he doomed his own rule. Now, which all goes to show how difficult it is to read the mind of someone from a distance. I think that he is, I mean, this is a real, this is a man who's a real non-entity. He was elevated in order to protect the corrupt Yeltsin family. He was deeply involved in the bombing of the apartment bombings, of the apartment buildings. Who is it who's capable of murdering hundreds of randomly chosen fellow citizens as a provocation in order to seize power? I mean, you have to be a very special person. Madeleine Albright, who was our Secretary of State at the time of the apartment bombings, wrote an op-ed in the New York Times in which she said that Putin turned away from the democratic path, or the path of democratic development, and is leading his country to ruin. The fact that he's leading his country to ruin is absolutely obvious. The idea that he ever had any interest in democratic development is absolutely unbelievable, that a Secretary of State could make such a statement, particularly because I know, on the basis of information that I got through the Freedom of Information Act, that our State Department was well informed that the apartment bombings were a provocation and that they were carried out by the regime, and chose to ignore it, making themselves complicit in a terrorist act. Now, they may have done it out of fear of the consequences, but we wouldn't have these consequences if we had acted when the crime occurred. And so,
how far do you think, and with the understanding that we can't get inside anybody's mind, I've talked to our audience about the sort of psychological diagnosis that you have people doing on television or on the radio on a regular basis of Vladimir Putin. I'll leave that to others, because that takes us away from actually dealing with the facts as they are, which is what you're talking about, how important it is, David, to deal with the facts as they are. And we're seeing Vladimir Putin for who he is. Based on your research and reporting, how far do you think he is willing to go here?
Yeah, well, it's a question. I mean, and it's a question, to tell you the honest truth, that I cannot completely answer. I think he'll go as far as he's allowed to go. He'll go until he's stopped. And I think the Ukrainians and the resistance of the West can stop him. Would he resort to barbaric weapons, or will he? Unfortunately, I think the likelihood of that is very high. They used barbaric weapons in Aleppo. They used them in Grozny. They leveled Aleppo, which was an ancient and beautiful city. Grozny, by the way, was also a very charming city before it began to look like Stalingrad. And I mean, there may be some hesitation to inflict that kind of damage on Ukrainian civilians for a couple of reasons. One, this has been depicted to the Russian public as a special operation to remove a Nazi clique, and the propaganda has emphasized that the very humane Russian forces are sparing the civilian population and simply attacking military infrastructure. During the first week, that was more or less true. It's becoming much less true now, and it could become a great deal less true in the future. But that will be a difficult thing to explain to Russians who have Ukrainian relatives. It's also important to remember many Russians are of Ukrainian origin. They were born, they may live in Novosibirsk, but they were born in Kyiv, or born in Kharkov, or somewhere else. It was an accident of fate in many cases that they found themselves living in what was called the Russian Federation after the breakup of the Soviet Union, because when the Soviet Union existed, people moved from one so-called Soviet republic to the other. Uh, will they hesitate? The other factor is that, of course, the Ukrainians ethnically are, it's the same ethnic group as the Russians in this respect, but the history, culture, and psychology are completely different, and the religion is different, uh, and the national identity is different. But that may, it's easier to bomb people who are different from you, uh, if you're savage enough to bomb anyone. Uh, these people are too similar. Uh, and then there's the question of who's going to carry out those orders. And any attempt to launch a nuclear attack uh, without a provocation, without well, under any circumstances except self-defense, could well encounter the resistance of the military. I have to bear in mind that not everyone is in love with this character. The videos of Alexei Navalny have been widely seen, which show the incredible corruption of Putin and his cronies. Navalny's last video, which was called A Palace for Putin, was viewed by 120 million people. And his other videos have also been very successful in terms of viewership.
And he's
And
just so
then
everyone's,
it's
an important, it's just an important name. And for those that their ears may be new to that name, he's Navalny is a anti-corruption investigator,
and blogger, yeah.
I mean, it's you call it people, there's fashion bloggers, David. So sometimes using that term for me, I'm like, he's documentarian. He's in prison though in Russia at this very moment because of his work. And I think that's important to note. But you were saying he exposed Putin's palace, which is this real estate. I mean, this piece of property, you could even call it a piece of property that showed where some of the money is going.
And I mean, the Russians don't need any reminder. They know the regime is completely corrupt and completely lawless. As even one person who favored the invasion told me, he says, Russians will forgive Putin a lot for defending, Russian speakers and defending the artificial breakup of the country, although the country has been broken up for 30 years and Russia has signed numerous treaties with Ukraine, including in 1997 a treaty of friendship, which of course, needless to say, recognized the territorial integrity of Ukraine. But the other thing is, besides being aware of the corruption, they're also aware of the bombings. And they're also aware of the terrorist acts. I mean, they don't talk about it. People who investigated the 1999 bombings, they were murdered. They were murdered. They were my friends. They were Yuri Shekhatchikhin, Sergei Yushchenko, Alexander Litvinenko, who was poisoned with an nuclear isotope in London, and the London court found Putin probably responsible. And they put in the probably because all of us writing about these things, for example, when I wrote about the apartment bombings, I could only use the evidence that I could get. I didn't have subpoena power. I didn't have the ability to compel anybody to talk to me. Those people who had those powers were completely under the control of the Putin regime. And this gets into why the awful, really awful record of American journalism and diplomacy in dealing with Russian atrocities. They throw up some type of absurdity, and we repeat it, and then we move on. And it was, I spent really 20 years trying to explain to this country and to the world the danger that Putin represented, that a man who was capable of participating in an atrocity like the apartment bombings is capable of anything. We
Well,
saw another
and let me
example with the shooting down of the Malaysian airliner.
let me just review that just briefly, because we talked about it last time, and you really say this is the basis for everyone to understand this current regime, is to understand that Vladimir Putin, according to your reporting, arranged that his a terrorist attack on his own people, exploding apartment buildings in Moscow in the middle of the night and murdering innocent people as a way to coalesce support, to provide a scapegoat for a war in Chechnya that would then further empower him. And here he's been in power for the better part of 3 decades at this point. It's interesting looking back at our interview from last week where we talked about that in depth. David, I mentioned this to you. I was looking to see if I could find images of the terrorist bombings, the apartment building bombings, pardon me, in Moscow in 1999. Didn't find that much, but as I was going through it, I did find an article written by the Washington Post, and this kind of comes to what you're saying here. The Washington Post was talking about terrorist attacks during the Putin regime, and was attributing this terrorist attack to the Chechens, and saying that it was a conspiracy theory that the Russian government was involved. But you just told us in this interview that you used a Freedom of Information Act, otherwise known as a FOIA. People may hear that term, where a journalist can say to the government, hey, I actually think there's a public value to getting some more information that maybe not readily accessible. And you use that. And a judge can say yes or no. A judge can say, okay, yeah, you can get it, or no, you can't. In your case, you were able to get some
I
information that
got a
leads you.
few things. I didn't get much, but even what I got confirmed what I was saying. What was the date on that Washington Post
I
story?
have to look back on it. It'll be somewhere in my.
Because that's typical. I mean, there was a journalist from the Washington Post when my book came out. The less you know, the better you sleep. I decided that the fact that a previous book, which I had written called Darkness at Dawn, had not inspired quite the response I wanted. I thought, well, maybe it's because they don't understand. Maybe it's too complicated for them. So I had a Washington publisher who was also a friend invited a group of fairly influential journalists to a dinner. Before the book came out, so I could explain to them things they might not have grasped, and I gave detailed explanations so that even they could understand that it was that when people are arrested caught red-handed, you're not talking about a conspiracy theory anymore. Did they react to it? No. It
I mean,
is
this.
really, I think we need to understand that we have a problem of superficiality in the United States. People reject and even react with hostility to things that are outside their accustomed frame of reference. Now, we saw the kind of herd that stampeded to communicate false stories about the Steele dossier and the Trump collusion hoax, even though there was no basis for that, even though anyone who was even remotely qualified would have seen that it was a hoax, as I did in the National Review, and it's have since been acknowledged for that. But the fact that I was the only person to do that in the immediate wake of the release of the Steele dossier and its publication in BuzzFeed is a sign of just how shallow we've all become.
Well, it's one of the reasons why I wanted to start SmartHER News, is call it Building a Solution in News, is just rededicating to nonpartisan information. And, even in this, my little battle that I'm fighting on a regular basis, David, it's partly
Not
for
such a
that
little
reason.
battle.
Well,
It's not a
yes.
little battle, Jenna.
No, well, the group think is strong. And let me be clear, when we hear dossier, when we hear these different stories that come up, depending on the listener's political persuasion, may have um, different feelings on that. This issue with journalism and telling the truth and facts and uh, primary sources is an issue that extends beyond party. We're really talking about the state of American journalism. And if we can wrap it back to what we're seeing here in Russia and Ukraine, it comes to telling an accurate story, because we need to know the truth to be able to have whatever sort of reaction we're free to have in this country to solid information. And so as you see the reporting being done on Ukraine and Russia, do you think that there's mistakes being made in the American media that you think could be dangerous to how we're approaching this topic?
Right now, I think it's being reported accurately. We needed to prevent this from happening.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in fact, news outlets are largely because their own personal agendas are no longer involved, perhaps, or because the facts are so obvious that even the most superficial person can see what's going on. But when it was a question for decades of trying to understand the way in which events were moving, then it was, first of all, of course, these partisan considerations which invaded the willingness to look at the truth, the genuine disbelief that such things are possible, which I understand, of course, but
Yes.
that's not an excuse. The distraction of drawing Russia into internal American political fighting, which the Russians are happy to be part of. I mean, one of the reasons why, if we go back to the Steele dossier, it contains so much Russian disinformation, which was provided by the Russians, was because they knew it would tie up the United States in knots, which is exactly what it did do for a long period of time. But now we're paying the price. But I don't expect that we're going to see a disinformation in the U.S. press now. I think that but
your point's well taken,
we
though,
needed
which
to prevent this situation.
right, which is that if for the American people had heard for years that Vladimir Putin bombed his own people in order to secure his power, if we heard the horrors of what was happening under that regime in more clear terms, then perhaps we'd prioritize differently, or leaders may prioritize differently. This is how the freedom of the press is
We had a
effective.
reset policy. I remember one conversation I had with one of the leaders of the so-called reset policy. This was President Obama, but it could have been any of the presidents. I mean, George Bush was also similarly naive. And Boris Nemtsov, who was murdered in February 2015, was an opposition leader, and he and I spoke to this person, and we explained to him that the Putin did not need a reset policy. He needed deterrence, and that anyone capable of carrying out these kinds of atrocities was dangerous. Of course, it fell on deaf ears. There were career considerations, which are extremely powerful in our bureaucracy. There was no, and the fact that when a political agenda is set, nobody has time for really serious study. The kind of study and in-depth examination of issues that's necessary in dealing with Russia is counterindicated by the way policy is made. I've seen that time and time again. There were
So,
cases.
well, let me just stop you there. And I'm sorry, David, but let me just stop you
Yeah.
there, because if we bring it back to the story that we're handling now, and we're talking about deterrence that we could have had
Mhm.
to prevent this situation, then how do we apply what we missed so we don't miss it this time around? What does that look like in policy form? What questions should we be asking so that it doesn't repeat itself?
Well, that's a question for the future, because now we have the war that we have the war, the loss of thousands of lives, the disruption that's going to result from it, and there's going to be, I think, disruption. we're now in a much more straightforward situation. Once this situation is resolved, as I hope it will be, with a victory for the Ukrainian side and an end to the kleptocracy in Russia, once that happens, we will again be in a situation in which it'll be important to understand that our foreign policy, our journalism, our diplomacy all failed. It's a sign of that failure that this has happened. We should, this is what we're, our foreign policy should be organized to prevent. And therefore, if there's a new era, and of course there will always be a new era, I think, we have to pay much more attention to the kind of integrity and intellectual rigor that and bravery that's necessary in order to face the truth, even when it's seems fantastic and it's unpalatable and it doesn't fit with our political rivalries and bureaucratic preferences. That's the thing, but that won't come until after this crisis is passed. I mean, this crisis is the payback for what we didn't do in 20 years after Putin came to power, or 30 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, because the criminal state in Russia was created by Yeltsin. And we, who we treated as kind of the emblem of democracy. The idea was that all we had to do was back Yeltsin, and we were backing democracy. And of course, that relieved us of the obligation to think.
So I have a bunch of questions, and I'm going to be looking at
Mm-hmm.
my phone, which I don't like to do, but I have all of them on my phone
Mm-hmm.
from our audience. And I thought it would be fun, fun in quotes, David, because we're dealing with very
Mm-hmm.
difficult topics, for them to be able to speak to you directly with some of their questions
Sure.
from last week. So I'm going to pull those up. They often ask the best questions, I must say, which is always true of the audience, isn't it? It's something that we realize. We've covered, there's been a lot of questions about denazification and that term, denazification. It's the first time I've ever heard that term. It's the first time that some of our audience has also heard that term. And Paula was wondering about that. If you could clarify that, is that something that's common in Russia? Is that a term that's been used often? And what exactly does Vladimir Putin mean by that?
We talked about denazification in Germany after the end of the Second World War, when people who had been part of the Nazi regime were removed from positions of responsibility. But the Putin uses that term to characterize, to vilify and characterize the Ukrainian leadership and pretend that they are Nazis, which of course they are not. And he also uses the term genocide to refer to the war in the Donbass, and a figure that he throws out is 14,000 dead. That is the official death toll, of course, which doesn't amount to genocide. Genocide is the destruction of an entire people, as, for example, the fate of the Jews in Europe during the Second World War. But 14,000 people killed in a war, it's terribly tragic, but that's the death toll of a war. And in that case, what has happened, of those 14,000, there were 3,000 civilian deaths, 7,000 separatists who were killed by the Ukrainian army, and roughly 4,000 to 5,000 Ukrainian soldiers who were killed. And that's not genocide, of course, but that all of the official figures, all of and spokesmen for the Putin regime use this word genocide and the word denazification because they're trying to mislead the Russian public to think that this is somehow a crusade against Nazis, and that the elected government in Ukraine, which was headed by a Jewish person, and in a country in which the far right parties have gotten practically no support, no votes at all, is Nazi, which is ridiculous. I mean, Ukraine is, for all of its faults, is a democracy, and Russia is a manipulated dictatorship with the very kind of kleptocratic ruling group that they're accusing Ukraine of having. So these are just terms that are made up, basically. Denazification, as if the Russian regime had any such intention, and genocide as if there had been any kind of genocide, when in fact there wasn't. There was a war, and there were the casualties of a war, and that war was instigated by Russia on Ukrainian territory to tear off part of eastern Ukraine, which they succeeded in doing. So, I mean, it's all, it's just massive lying. And as I said, it's the kind of lying, the scale of lying that's best carried out by a totalitarian regime, which can choke off all alternative sources of information. In this case, that's going to be very difficult. And I think the consequences are going to be that there will be opposition inside Russia.
Megan is asking, why is it worth it to Putin? What is this all about? Gleason wanted to know what's the ultimate goal, but that's a great way to phrase it. Why is this worth it for him at this point?
I think that for one thing, he expected an easy victory. And when they seized Crimea, and that was an easy victory, they seized part of Ukraine. His popularity rose dramatically, and it stayed high for 5 years. He was, and I wrote this is what I wrote in the Wall Street Journal, that his goal was to reinforce the regime, to coalesce the population against a corrupt regime in which it was losing faith. Well, that's exactly what General Leonid Ivashko said in his statement. And so that was what I think they were intending. They thought it would be an easy victory, that it would be, that it would reinforce the regime's control, that it would play to the nationalism and, I would say, chauvinism of the population. And Russians missed being able to inspire fear. And it seemed that nobody cared about, their threats anymore. So in a sense, Putin felt that he was going to, quote unquote, restore their greatness by making them once again a power that had to be considered, that had to be feared, and that in the process, Russians would forgive all of his thievery, all of his murderousness, all of the illegality. I don't think that calculation is going to work.
Sherry, well, and this is a great follow-up question to that, because Sherry was wondering who's in Vladimir Putin's posse. She wants to know who's waiting in the wings. Let's say that Vladimir Putin doesn't maintain his power. But does that matter for a change in Russia, depending on who else is high in the government there?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, anyone who takes over from him, even if they themselves are implicated in his crimes, will automatically seek to undo some of what he's done, and definitely seek to reestablish ties with the West and put an end to the war, because otherwise there's no reason to overthrow him. Whether that happens or not, because obviously the interests of a lot of people have been damaged, and more people are going to be damaged by the continuation of this conflict. The assets of the central bank have been frozen. There are many operations they can no longer carry out, including export operations involving oil and gas. Their income for the country is going to fall, and fall sharply. Russian planes can't land. There are all kinds of contacts are being disrupted. They aren't going to get spare parts for their planes. they're not going to have their planes serviced. Those planes are not going to be able to fly. It's going to be an increasingly disorganized and chaotic situation inside Russia.
And
So
so
I don't think that anybody who overthrows Putin, if that were to happen, would then carry out his same policies, because he would have to rely on those who are, in order for such an operation to succeed, he would have to rely on the support of elements that are suffering as a result of Putin's policies and would want them changed.
well, Caitlin was asking, what will be enough to make Putin withdraw? And let's add the context of these different meetings that have taken place between the Ukrainian sides, the Russian sides. Do you see there being a pathway forward where Vladimir Putin is able to save face and his ego is able to accept something that's different than taking a major Ukrainian city or a continued war? I mean, what potentially could be on the table for both sides if there is any room for that?
It's hard to say. I mean, Yeltsin agreed to an unconditional surrender, basically, defeat in Chechnya. They disguised it in various ways, but that's what it was. But Yeltsin was much more dependent than Putin on an election. Putin is so identified with this, it's hard to see what he can accept unless he himself is threatened, and it's hard to see how he himself would be threatened. So it looks like a formula for a long war. That's the problem, and unless forces can mobilize inside the country, after all, if you've got 200, 300, 500,000 people on the street, it may not be a simple matter to suppress them, and you may not be able to find military units that are willing to do it. I don't think whatever popularity he had, he's rapidly losing, and he'll lose more. It's not, I think the long and short of it is it's not going to be easy. But a great deal will depend on what happens in Russia itself. If those, there are forces in Russia that could compel him to bring this to a halt. And the problem is, as long as it goes on, it's a threat to the security of the U.S.
Well,
And needless.
and that's what Libby's asking. She said, "Do you think Putin will stop at Ukraine? Do you?" And we just spoke to, again, the lawmaker in Ukraine that said, "Don't look at the eastern border of Ukraine as just the eastern border of Ukraine. Look at the eastern border of Ukraine as the eastern border of Europe. If you do not confront Vladimir Putin now, you're going to be dealing with something much bigger." So, to Libby's question, do you think he will stop at Ukraine? Do you think that, based on what he said even in the past, was Ukraine the horizon, or is something else on the horizon?
I think that if there's a war in Ukraine, and the kind of war that's developing, a partisan war, that would, I mean, and if there's an effective economic crackdown, that he will not have the means to go beyond Ukraine. But it means also that the U.S. should take every defensive measure to build up the NATO powers, particularly the Baltic states, that might be subject to intimidation or attack. I mean, if he could make some spurious justification for an invasion of Ukraine by saying that he was uniting Slavic people, or that this was former Soviet territory and this was our historic country, he can't make any such claim about. Well, he could, because Poland, Finland, and the Baltic states were all part of the Russian Empire at one point, but that's a much more tenuous claim. And you have to be able to tell people something to explain why they should risk their lives. You can't just say, well, it's because I feel like it.
And it's a really interesting point about the economic side of it too, that you just don't have endless resources of people. That doesn't mean that this couldn't extend for a long time. I know we've gone a while, David. Quick
No,
question, and this is kind of, I was trying to find the name of the viewer that wrote this in, because I thought this would be an interesting thing for you to entertain. First of all, have you ever sat down with Vladimir Putin? Have you ever done an interview with him or requested one? And hope for that?
No, but it's not difficult to do. They used to have these conferences, the Valdai Discussion Club, in which they invited journalists or select journalists and academics and then disinformed them. And they would, and the big prize was, direct access to Putin. So a lot of people have had that. But they never invited me. I was probably the only reasonably well-known journalist who wasn't invited, because I would, the first thing I would have asked him about is these bombings. And many of those people who are posing now on cable television as Russia experts were big veterans of this Valdai conference, where they made their careers repeating Russian disinformation. Russian intelligence has a name for this. They call it ventriloquism. And these are the people who oftentimes have kind of muddied the waters for the American public. They muddied the waters for the government and muted some of our responses. And they've encouraged. They didn't completely fool people, but they had the effect of influencing them in such a way that they would default to their existing prejudices and existing view of the world, and would not try to go deeper. I don't know if they still have the Valdai discussion group. Maybe it's the end of discussion. But many of our most prominent Soviet experts are veterans of Valdai, so-called prominent Russia experts are veterans of Valdai, where they were very anxious to give their questions to Putin and then uncritically repeat, whatever stupidities he
Well,
conveyed to them.
it's not something that's unique to Russia, is it, David? Right? That's done here in the United States, where you could have an off-the-record conversation or background conversation with, senior officials, and you feel very, you feel good, like a little bit elite, that you've been invited to this, and you're going to go
That
in
was
there
the
and,
psychology, yeah.
right, of course. And you're like, this is great. And these, it's not off the record because you're able to report it. So it's on background for your information and your education, but you have to you have to take it to the next step, which is what you're saying. It's not necessarily the instinct of
No, but
everyone.
here in the case of the Valdai discussion group, a lot of these people then would quote, would recycle they were directly fed disinformation, about, and then they would say, well, the Russians view it in such and such a way, high-level Russian sources, or they would even name the sources, say that, Putin is a 19th century nationalist. He believes in a world of spheres of influence. They don't want to say that he's actually, the product of the St. Petersburg criminal world, and he doesn't care about anything except theft and terrorizing his opponents, and because that wouldn't sound good.
Right.
So,
And they wouldn't get invited
in
back
fact,
to the next meeting,
you wouldn't
right?
get
Right.
invited back.
Right.
You wouldn't get invited back. And by the way, a lot of the stuff from the Valdai conference, and this is one of the reasons I was quick to recognize it, filtered into the Steele dossier.
Oh, interesting.
Many of the themes that had been repeated, in fact, even the language. So if you were reading the Steele dossier with an awareness, which our people should have had, of of years of disinformation in Valdai, you would see that the same things are being repeated here, but packaged as inside information to make credible, as it happened, an attack on Trump. But it could have been an attack on Hillary Clinton. It could have been an attack on anyone if they felt that was to their advantage, because they didn't care about the candidate. What they really cared about was disrupting American society.
And
And they
that's what
did.
that's what we need to underscore. It's not as partisan as we all think it is here. It's an attack against American culture.
Well, this
I feel
partisan mentality here is one of the things that disarms us and makes us a vulnerable society.
and also an expression of a free society. because we're able to have these righteous debates with each other all the time. So it's the expression of it, and it's also a vulnerability of it. I feel like we need a separate hour to go over the dossier now that it's not in, front page news, and really unpack that, because it's still like it's here. It is. It's still here. Okay, so this was the question. I can't. My apologies to our viewer who I can't find their name, but this is kind of a good final question, David, which is, if you had the opportunity to sit across from Vladimir Putin right now, what would be your question? What are the questions that we should be asking him?
Well, I mean, I don't think we should be asking him questions. We should be telling him.
Hmm.
But when there was a time to have that conversation, the only thing we should have been discussing was the shooting down of the Malaysian airliner, because this is a murder of 300 passengers on a civilian airliner. A Russian crew came in with a Russian anti-aircraft battery, crossed the border, fired a missile, unless the crew was somehow replaced, which is hard to believe, at a plane flying in an international air corridor, down the plane, and then left, and after one shot withdrew to Russia. Well, what does that tell you? I mean, that that needed to be raised not in 2022, but in 2014. In fact, I did write in the Wall Street Journal that the United States needed to close airspace to Russian aircraft. But that was 5 years ago. But if we had done it at the time, we wouldn't have had to do it now. That's the thing. And the murder of the passengers on MH17 was more than enough to justify that. So, I mean, we're reacting in some respects. We're reacting in the right way. I hope that we will remain steadfast and expand these sanctions to the point that there's a real economic chokehold on Russia. But that doesn't answer the question of why it had to happen and why so many people, Russian and Ukrainian, had to die and are going to die. That's the other issue. And it's
So,
one that we're going to have to face at some point.
well, and obviously wrestle with that question about how willing we are to get involved in different ways, whether it's
Mhm.
economically or otherwise. We can't tell the future. We've talked about that. You're not clairvoyant, no matter how much we all wish that we were. What are you going to be watching for the next week, David? And what are the different storylines that you think are important for us to pay attention to understand what could be next?
We need to watch the reaction of the Russian soldiers. Any information we have about desertions, sabotage in the ranks is important. Any reaction in Moscow by military figures, military and political figures, no matter how tepid, because it expresses something deeper. The reaction of the public in Moscow, the willingness of people to go out and get arrested, all of these things are things we have to watch, because that will be critical to bringing this to an end. And we just have to hope, because this is just unprovoked aggression against a democratic country for all its faults, and a peaceful country, which is absolutely aligned with the United States and seeks to become part of the West. So we all have a stake here, and in limiting further aggression, and limiting somebody whose tactics, he talks about denazification. His tactics are absolutely Hitlerite, and his rhetoric is Hitlerite. Not a very happy situation, but we have to kind of rise to the challenge.
I'm just curious. The person that you said that you talked to that favored the invasion, do they still favor the invasion?
I don't know. I may be able to get back to him.
Mm.
I may or may not. We'll see. I'm weighing that. I can't tell you I don't think it's a good idea right now to tell you too much more, but maybe if we talk again, I'll have more information about that. So as not to jinx the possibility that we'll have more information, let's leave it for now and see what I can do.
Let's let the story develop, in other words, which I think
Yeah,
is
yeah.
an important meditative experience as a journalist. You both have to be very close to the facts and want all of them, and then realize that you also are just an observer of something else, a story that has its own life. So just want to mention everybody, David, that they could find all the information about you along with your many books at davidsatter.com. That's where they could find you. You're also all over social media. One person was asking if you'll run for president. That's also another conversation for another time.
Right,
But
but
maybe we don't know. We don't
let's
know where
talk,
it's going to go.
it's Russia. That's the first time that's been mentioned for the US, but people have definitely mentioned me for president of Russia.
Come
And I
on.
said, yeah, in the Russian social media.
Well, then we would like the exclusive when that happens. Let me just put in my request. Now, if that's okay. I mean, it's an interesting world. You never know what's going to happen. All right, David, it's great to talk to you as always. Thank you so much for your time, and we'll do it again. We'll do it again. This story will continue.
Okay, Jenna, I look forward always to talking to you.
Quick, concise, nonpartisan, smarter news, a refuge from the storm. I'm Jenna. Thank you for choosing smarter.